So I guess I might just start with, could you describe the methods used to teach international relations in your country? You could be attentive to the way your curriculum is structured, if particular historical contexts are brought into to supplement readings, and I guess what theoretical approaches are stressed on the curriculum.
Um, the way I teach is quite different from how other people do it. A very few colleagues of mine but will be doing something peculiar in the eyes of most of my other colleagues. For example, a colleague of mine who taught at the Southern University, National Shen University, who unfortunately had passed away 6 or 7 years ago, she would include not only mainstream theory, but also at her time, like securitization will be taught. She definitely would include the feminism, and and everybody knew that if you're going to pass the entrance examination to her institute, they would have to read feminism, IR, feminist IR. But then she passed away. I don't know anyone else
Mm.
uh, who, since her um, passing away, that have also include the feminism in their syllabus, not to my knowledge so far. Um, and myself will do uh, civilizational approach. I don't start from realism, but I assume people know about realism. I usually start by telling people um, realism is what not they think.
Mm.
Usually in my countries, everything is considered being realist, even though they're not really in line with realism, but the people would automatically think, oh, that's realism. For example, when US invasion of Afghanistan 2002 and 2003 and Iraq, I think most of my colleagues would immediately say, oh, that's realism. You see, the big country beats small country. That's realism. And I was like, no, realism is not big country beat the small countries. And why would Afghanistan or Iraq challenge the United States if they're much smaller in the first place? So it's not just big country beat a small country. That's not realism, but that's how they understand it even today. Um, Probably have to do with both. We only know um, realism uh, in our familiar language, IR language, you only know realism. So everything being considered realism. And secondly, because Taiwan is such a um, is such a weird, bizarre position internationally, considered as a national actor in theory, but not really a sovereign state in international law. So people would feel very frustrated and depressed, and then they would automatically think, oh, because Taiwan is a weak country, it's a small country compared with China, which is a big country. So we can easily explain our position by saying, oh, we're just a small country, and that's realism, and the small country always get beaten by big country. Uh, in that in that particular lens, I think most people are not really interested in any alternative. Uh, and with the determinations to resist China, the only support we think we can get is from the United States. So whatever the United States says, then we adopt it. Um, so there's almost no alternative. And I know some of my colleagues teaching international relations, they list on their syllabus realism, liberalism, constructivism, as everyone else will probably do, at least for major part of their classes. But some of them only would go through realism. They will share a few major books uh, from classical realism, from new classical realism, or from neorealism. And then they say, oh, well, we don't have time to teach the rest. You have to read by yourself because we use up all the time. So they just pick up 3 or 4 or 5 books major books of realism, starting from perhaps Morgenthau,
Mm.
and um, and then through, of course, Watts and Mearsheimer, and all the familiar names. Some of them would include constructivism, but most people don't really know what constructivism is all about. Not to mention critical IR at all. And if you talk about civilization in IR, you talk about pluralism, you talk about post-colonialism in IR, students would completely lost.
Mm.
So when they come to my class, I was talking about the debate about certain IR theory being racist.
Mm.
Uh, they don't understand. They would consider racism being a realistic issue. And
Mm.
how can theory be racist?
Mm.
Only human beings can be racist. You have a policymaker racist. How can a theory be racist? This
Mm.
cannot be right.
Mm.
For many of them. So I would run into a lot of problem teaching this kind teaching IR courses, and not just teaching students come from my own societies. If I offer course in English, mostly will be international students taking them. However, most international students would have no IR background. They take course because it's in English. They don't have enough English courses to take in order to complete their requirements. So they take anywhere on campus, there's an English class that they take it. So
Mm.
you'll have a lot of people coming from a discipline that no IR background. If they have no IR background, they don't believe in you. They wouldn't even listen to I
Mm.
don't know. They don't show that in class, but my teaching assistant telling me that, Professor, they don't believe in you because they of the class they'll say that's not, this is just nonsense. How can they be possible?
Mm.
So that's, I think, the basic situation in my community. And at one time, I have a master student working on a project, how realism as a theory can um, help people in Taiwan psychologically.
Mm.
And he come up with this idea of, this game theory idea of a triangle theory. Everybody's applying triangle because that's easy. That's you and your regional opponents plus United States. Then you have triangle. So everybody can use triangle and, and apply game theory. And then if we review all the major international conferences that we've held in late 90s and the early 20s to 21st centuries, we find that Ministry of Education, National Science Council, and Ministry of Foreign Affairs spent all their money supporting international conference on triangle relationship.
Mm.
And that's very interesting. And I thought there was a psychological underpinning of it because on a triangle scale, Taiwan is a equal partner,
Mm.
which you would not possibly be in foreign policy. You always consider yourself being weak and small, but in a game theory, in a triangle theory, you have options. You have a choice to ally with China or United States.
Mm.
But I think it's nonsense because no one in Taiwan would dare say that we unite with China to fight against United States being the strongest power.
Mm.
Right? That's before the rise of China. That was late 90s, early 21st century. There was no such thing as the rise of China. Right? And obviously, from realist point of view, China and Taiwan should join force to
Mm.
balance United States as the strongest power in the region, right? But that's not possible. But we're still using triangle as if we have choice. And
Mm.
we can be equal to both China and United States because we have choice.
Mm.
Uh, but actually, we don't think we have choice.
Mm.
So you see this uh, kind of a mutual entanglement of theory and foreign policy and the political, cultural, and ontological security of the country.
Mm.
You know? So if you're asking how international relations being taught in Taiwan. That's, I think, basically just everybody would talk about realism. Some would go into institutionalism if they graduate, if professors graduate from Europe, they would probably more interested in bringing institutional approach, using EU as a model, and see or explain why there's no similar organization in East Asia. But this is already very rare. Even though I know a couple of, maybe more than a couple of them will be doing that. Constructivism is almost very rare. So that's the whole picture. I'm sorry that my colleague, who's my college classmate, passed away 6-7 years ago. She's been doing wonderful work, and just she introduced Copenhagen School securitization, and also feminism and all the other, post-colonial studies, but not anymore. And I don't really teach IR, and I do that as a supplemental course. We have other people teaching IR for students who want to prepare their examination, all kinds of examination to Ministry of Foreign Affairs, examination to be master students or PhD students. So we have people doing that, and that's for examination purpose. And some people would have examine question on constructives. I think it's very rare. I've really not seen examining questions related to constructivism so far. It's all about realism, about war, about maybe new institutionalism. That's maybe 1/4 of maybe we have 4 questions, and maybe one of them will be new institutionalism. You will have a question on security. You have a question on some kind of regional affairs. You have a question on realism for sure. Things like that. If you go beyond that, that's not fair to people, because people never read about it. How could you test them on those questions?
No, well, thank you so much for that really comprehensive overview of what's happening in Taiwan. I do really appreciate it. And it's very interesting to hear how much realism is so prominent and that connection between theory and foreign policy. But I think something I was interested in hearing about is, you mentioned you spoke about, you teach that civilization course. Could you speak to, what you're teaching students and how that obviously differs from that more typical realist approach seen in Taiwan?
Well, I think I start by somehow provoking students to believe that realism is not about just big country beat small country. That's not realism. The first one, I think, is very important. Doesn't matter what they have read from all those wonderful books. The impression they have got is the big country beat small country. That's realism. I think maybe that's realistic in our situation, but that's not realism. So I would usually start by reviewing what realism is about and why U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2002 and 2003, which is very big in Taiwan at that time, because people debating whether they want to join force with the United States and they go to Iraq and fight for freedom. So I will start by doing that, and then immediately I will go into racism. I would force people to think how colonial past have made international relation possible as a theory. How international relation and theorization of international is possible only with colonialism. If there's no colonies, you wouldn't have civilizational progress, or you have no contrast of civilized and uncivilized, or barbaric or savage country. You have no such comparison. How could you claim you're being progressive civilizationally? So you must have those countries, inferior countries. So you can claim being civilization. And of course, the reason you can claim that because you have moved from war to institution. And the reason you have war, of course, you're competing for colonies. So you have war. Now you resolve that question. Now you stop fighting each other. Then you say you are becoming more civilized because you no longer fight over colonies. The colonies all become independent countries. But that's fine. I would go on and say, then why those post-colonial countries are either failing state because they're the ethnic groups being divided by borders that colonial power drew in history. And so they are forced to become part of a sovereign territory with other groups. So they wouldn't have to fight each other, but then once they become one sovereign countries, they have to decide between them. They have to distribute resources. Who's going to own power? So they have to fight each other. If they fight each other, then the same group of people across border will come to rescue, right? If they get victimized, so some people, then that would be not just civil war. There will be intervention. There will be so you have ethnic cleavage. You cannot be successful in nation building. So I would say, see, that's the failing state. Failing state actually was created by colonial past. And then if there are countries, post countries, who are able to group themselves together and trying to get rid of colonial past or to resist the international intervention, then they become rock state. So we have, see, you have all those categories already ready, international theories, for you to know who those people are. And very unfortunately, some rock state become so strong, and they even influence other states. They become revisionist. So we have everything. So China become revisionist, Russia become revisionist. So we have everything ready for them, in theory. So I would just tell them why all these categories making sense. It's not just because they're universal, they're abstract, so somebody so smart, they can apply those categories and tell you what's going on in the world, what's wrong with the international order, who has to be responsible. I was telling that it is your theory, which caused problem. I saw some people walking away from my classes and saying, oh, well, all this probably is very political. But, we're not going to continue on this track because this is not going to get us anywhere. So most of them would get away and forget about what we discussed in class. Some small minority would remember this discussion, but then they couldn't do anything about it because they will have to take exam. They have to, go on in their career. So they would have to put it aside and do something else. So, and after racism, I go into feminism. Feminism is difficult for me because I've not been doing that for almost a couple of decades. I pick up the international relation course again very recently, in past 5, 7, 6 years. After my colleague passed away, I decided to offer international relations again, although we belong to different institutions. So I started doing international relations as supplemental to the main course. So I would add feminism. I used to work on feminist foreign policy in the early 90s, mid 90s. So I picked them again, but I still offer some courses. Offers a couple of weeks on feminist IR, some basic discussion and why diplomacy was masculine historically right from the beginning, and how patriarchal thinking and patriarchal organizations and patriarchal productive relations has been suppressive, especially on reproductive relationships. I kind of put emphasis on reproductive relationships and trying to force people to think about the interaction between productive relationship and reproductive relationship. And then I would move into pluriversal IR, which is again very difficult because most pluriversal IR at current stage basically is dialogue between a particular cosmological order and the West, because scholars only know their own culture and the Western culture. So the best they can do is to start interaction, a dialogue between these two, so that the Western scholar, their colleagues, either they're already very sympathetic or they're not. At least they can try to start something, so telling the West that there is something different. But then if everybody's doing that, then we basically everybody together just re-centralize the West, because we can only interact with the West, and because that's the only thing we can understand. So I was trying to find a way to establish dialogue between non-Western cosmological order, for example, like Confucius and the South African Ubuntu, for example. How can we compare them? That's difficult because our knowledge is just very limited. I'm very sad about that. But then if there are people in classes who can do something else, I will force them to help us out. Just bringing their own cultural background, so that we could have a dialogue. And I would bring in some kind of anthropological dimension, components, I would say, because I've been doing field work for I don't know how long. I started doing field work in China in 1994. I ended in 2006, but I started doing some kind of a field work in intellectual history. I'm still doing interviews. So I started doing my field work and trying to convince people that what we believe today is being rifles for thousands of years, or really not rifles. And if you're working at ground level, you will see people subscribing to different religions, civilization beliefs. They work together and they live together. They find their ways to coexist, even though they don't talk to each other. There's still ways to coexist. So I'm more interested in how people in their daily life coexist with people they think to be different. So I rely on my past field work, and I hope to do more field work in the future. I'm actually doing that now, to collect examples of different ways to coexist. So it's almost common sense. People can coexist in their daily life, but it's so bizarre, so weird at the level of international relations. And all this cosmological belief become, you weaponize those things and try to force people to choose sides. But in daily life, people don't do that. People live together. I mean, a student of mine come from Indonesia. We went to several different places in Indonesia. You find something very ironic. In Jakarta, where Chinese migrants, generation of Chinese migrants are almost completely assimilated into Indonesian indigenous culture. But you have all kinds of anti-Chinese campaign complaining about failed assimilation of Chinese population, especially around Jakarta. But if you go to some other places, if you go somewhere else, then you will find that the different religions, multiple religions, come together, live together, and these people probably are Sinicized. The indigenous people or Indonesian people, they speak Chinese dialect. They celebrate Chinese festival even during the anti-Chinese campaign period. There was no such thing as anti-China campaign in history. So you see, if people are indigenized, they become targets of anti-Chinese campaign. But if they criticize their neighborhood, there's no anti-China campaign. I mean, this is very ironic. And this is what I want to do. I hope to bring this experience to classes and so force people to think. You know, you think so abstract, so big things, a big theory that looks so neat, but then that's where the problems come from. Is the world doesn't really operate in binary, you know. But then the problem, of course, is that if you don't have binary, you don't know how to talk. I have this debate with another colleague of mine who unfortunately also passed away just a couple of years ago. My very good friend Li Liling. You probably heard about her name. We have a little debate about whether or not we should have categories which are binaries. She was opposed to anything, appear in binaries. I was like, no, we don't do that because discursively we couldn't talk without binaries. Like the West or China, you have to define what you mean by China or being Western, or what you mean by Confucians. And of course, there are many different factions in Confucians. There are many different factions. There's different kinds of democracy, different kinds of autocracy. But that doesn't mean we cannot use the term democracy as opposed to autocracy. I think we could argue that people practice autocratic governmentality and democratic mentality in different contexts. So we can be autocratic and democratic at the same time. Also, we probably don't know or doing that consciously. But that doesn't mean that we cannot have binaries. But anyway, we all opposed to binaries, but I accept binaries in our language. And I think that only by accepting binaries in our language, we can be more conscious of how binaries fail to lock us into a binary life. But that's because in reality, in our daily life, we don't act in a binary way. Only when we start thinking about it, we politicize it, we securitize it, then we have to choose sides, and we become locked into binaries. If we go back to our daily life to read novels, watch televisions, talk to friends everywhere, no, we are not living in binaries. So, but I think binary is useful in that sense. That allow us to talk. But language is being structured in such a way that we rely on categories to arrange our world, arrange our lives, right? So we have to know how other people use different categories. So in order to move around, that I wish to teach that way. So I gave a lot of my field experience that I had 12, I think 12 years of field research experience in China, in Chinese mountains, and so I have a lot of examples to cite. Although I no longer remember many of them because of aging. Because when I try to recollect something, I know something there. I just simply forgot what I want to say. I know there's something there. I used that before, but I just forgot. Unfortunately. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your reflections, and also particularly that concept of how you deal with binaries. It's something I'm also engaging with in my work. And so your reflections, I think, are really applicable to how, I'm also trying to think through how do you negotiate concepts of West and non-West and use these terms, but then also accept that there is a plurality or multiplicity behind it. So I think, thank you so much for your reflections on that. It's something that I think I hope to build on in my work too. But I guess, you spoke about introducing pluriversatility into your teaching practices. Could you also highlight, what are the challenges you face? I know you spoke particularly that examinations won't speak to that. So students might be learning this, but it might not be applicable later on. That you also raised that concept of political, I guess being assumed it was a political kind of act. So could you explain some of those challenges you face when you try to introduce things like pluriversatility or, other more critical approaches to IR Is that, yeah, in your experiences of that?
Since I don't expect students to work on these topics,
Mm,
my only purpose is just to force them to think differently.
mm,
And there's a way to unlearn what you've been
mm,
learning. My purpose is to um, perhaps in a political sense, try to force people to try unlearning their past learning. So if that's my purpose, I really don't see too many challenges,
mm,
because that already there. The only frustration is sometimes I just don't get a response.
mm,
Um, but then after a while, I can appreciate uh, the lack of responses because people was in either in shock, surprise. That doesn't mean that they don't listen.
mm,
I think they listen because sometimes when I start talking, I talk with enthusiasm. I start, I was very passionate about what I'm talking about. So I think that may um, get students into my emotion, so they would appreciate something important is going on, and they appreciate, I think, the alternative way of thinking. Also, the most of them, I think, are not able to immediately think of a feedback. If you force them to ask question, they will ask some question really either showing the deep-rooted stereotype they've had, just unable to ask question hearing this, and they were unable to understand the readings. Because these readings already assume you know much about realism, neorealism, and all those kind of things.
mm,
Um, they're already not very strong on the theory side. Of course, not many people are interested in theorization in the first place. And then because you still have to take the course, you need credit. So you take all those courses. And of those courses, you pass the courses.
mm,
For some reasons, you want to come to my class, then I think the challenge is on them, not on me, because I'm used to their responses. I'm used to silence. I'm used to disbelief in their eyes. I'm used to it already. So I no longer consider that challenge. I think that's just very, typical, seems to me. Maybe I'm stereotyped them, but I think that's my experience.
mm,
I wouldn't say there's no response or no feedback at all, but usually they come after a while.
mm,
When you talk to them, they say, well, we don't remember exactly what you said in class, but we know this world is problematic, or the theory we're using is problematic. We know something wrong with it, but we don't remember. But you know, um, but that's sad. But that's good. I don't know. That's probably the challenge. It's just you couldn't leave any mark on their thinking track. I'm just
no. Oh, well, thank you. No, thank you for those reflections. And I think that idea of silence and disbelief is quite interesting to hear you reflect on. I guess something that you spoke to earlier was that idea of how theory and foreign policy are really interconnected in the Taiwan context. Could you explore that and develop on that a little bit further? Particularly because I'm interested in understanding, well, what does dominance mean in your academic work? So I guess with reference to that, could you explore that concept?
um, foreign policy wise, the biggest enemy or rivals for Taiwan is China.
Mm,
Uh, so for foreign policy um, establishments and for academic mainstream who rely on the government to provide funding rely on think tanks also they work for also rely on government funding, also almost always government funding. If you want to be truly scholarly academically, go to National Science Council. But still, there you cannot get rid of policy concerns because people who review your proposal, your applications are also affiliated with foreign policy establishments. So they will also consider in policy terms. And in terms of policy and government sponsorship, they almost always go into those projects that can get better connections for Taiwan in particularly United States. And so they support conference and meetings and workshop where you can invite American scholars. If you can invite big names, better. And then we give a lot of money to them. So they come on first class aircraft, and they come in and they give a lectures which they don't prepare. I no longer go to those conferences because it's just very boring for me. But when I was younger, I went. I was sometimes excited to see big figures coming, and I was interested in challenging them, and then realizing nobody really in the audience is interested in the question I raised. But anyway, so this is the style that you get funding from government, and the government would hope to have better connection with American scholars who work for American think tanks, which also get money from my government. So they give all the money for the sake of their networking, academic networking, where big scholars or big think tank scholars who have a good relationship with the American government can enable our networking. Sometimes you, especially earlier when there's better relation between China and the United States, we couldn't, meet with anyone in official capacity in the United States. So we had to go through think tank scholars, and that was very important. So in that sense, I could understand why my government is doing that. They've been, so that's the deeply intertwined relationship between foreign affairs, foreign policy, and academic life in Taiwan. And the salary for a professor in Taiwan is relatively low compared with other East Asian countries. But we're not poor scholars because from better universities, you have projects from the government. So you could still make a very good living if you're well connected with the government. Even though you're not well connected, if you can work for people who are well connected, you still have a chance to make a good living because they have so many resources. And you have this trickle down to younger scholars, so they make a better living. So why would they question things? If the whole purpose of coming to teach is to make a living, why would they question things? Why would they, I understand that people, if everybody has their own lives to live, they have to make their own living. They have their families, their social circles, So I have mine. So that's actually my defense, and I'm not using this as their defense. I'm saying this to justify their choice. But actually, when I talk to them, I use this as my justification. I say everybody has run their own life, and this is the way I choose. So you let me go. I would just now I'm using the same thing that I justify my approach, and try to justify them.
Yeah. Well, no, thank you for that. It's a very interesting concept of that entwined nature. I mean, as yourself, as I guess what I would consider doing a lot of critical work, and coming up against that mainstream dominance where you're kind of expected to follow that realism, and traditional approaches. How has your academic work been affected by that mainstream approach, particularly as a critical scholar trying to break out of that?
Um, well, when I was younger, I would go to conferences. I would publish Chinese articles. So I would introduce all these critical works. Um, I no longer do that because I think my time is limited. As you get older, your time is more and more limited. You wanna concentrate on things that uh, things that you do better. Um, than just trying to go around and trying to provoke people. uh, so I become more internationally involved. I was I was concentrating on my own research if I went abroad in the past. Now when I go outside now as now I'm teaching in Tokyo for the month of June. I do international relations. I do critical international relations. So I start uh, getting inspiration and also getting support from international community. So finding other scholars who are more equally or perhaps more frustrated than I am from their own countries. And then you would feel reluctant to be critical of them when you saw some kind of um, colonial underpinning in their work, which they didn't realize. You know, I think when I was younger, I would just go straight and say, "Hey, this is still." But I no longer do that because I feel people need more real. Why? I should not let them die if they are much younger, especially. Um, so we basically just try to support each other, I guess, and coming together to work together, trying to come with something just different from the mainstream, so people would feel more comfortable, articulate or reflect critically on their past learning. Again, and learning is something I stress. Even with my younger colleagues in other countries, I would just
Mm.
yeah. Mm.
I guess going to that concept of unlearning, which you've been speaking about throughout this, can you explore, I guess, like what that means to you and how you approach that and how your students kind of begin to understand that concept?
I was trying to if I well, I used to um, um, let people reflect what they've been doing was not naturally, it was not natural. Now I don't do that now. What I'm doing now is to let people know they are practicing and learning every second. Instead of trying to consider and learning is something you have to do consciously, I'm trying to convince people, everything we encounter is a new thing. In order to incorporate whatever we encounter into our existing ideology or worldview, then we really have to adapt, no matter how little we're doing that. We really have to adapt in order to make everything sensible to us constantly, that we can making sense of things. So by incorporating things that either we have never thought of or encountered before, or was bizarre, strange, or um, um, wrong, morally wrong to us, when those things happened in front of us, we still have to make sense of them.
Mm.
By making sense of things that are unfamiliar to us, I now define all those process, practice, being, and learning.
Mm.
So now what I'm saying to people is that we are practicing and learning every second,
Mm.
so that we could begin doing that more consciously.
Mm.
Uh, so that's my strategy now. So I enlarge the scope of learning to such extreme extent that you cannot do without a learning.
Mm.
Um, um, so so making it very philosophical and abstract,
Mm.
instead of forcing people to think in their daily life, coming with examples how um, they try to either silence or forget about when they are doing wonderful, great IR work. Just trying to bring them back. That's what I did in the past.
Mm.
Um, but I'm trying a more philosophical, logical way now.
Mm. No. Well, no, thank you for exploring that. It's a really interesting concept. And it's really interesting to see how you're incorporating that into your own teaching. I am conscious of the time, but I just wanted to jump back to one concept that you said to close this off. And you spoke about that concept of coexistence, and always being in dialogue. And I wondered, is that how you also, I guess, when you're approaching teaching and I guess engaging students, are you using that concept of coexistence to really drive your curriculum or the way you kind of teach? Is that what you're hoping to get at? I guess the purpose of your teaching, or how does coexistence play out in your teaching practices, I guess?
Coexistence wasn't a conscious mission in the past.
Mm.
But then later on, I realized what I've been doing is to promote um, the possibility of coexist between any seemingly um, deadly rivals, either rivaling theories or rivaling groups, religions. But that's what I have begun to realize I've been doing in the past, but it wasn't conscious in the past.
Mm.
And the learning was part of this concept of coexistence.
Mm.
Coexistence means that recently I did a very short essay on why all the relationship system has to expand. You cannot stop expanding, because if you stop expanding, that means there is a limit to your relational order. That means your relational order is not natural. If it's not natural, then you will no longer be living it. You will get rid of it. So in order for you to continue subscribing to your own relational order, you will have to expand. And expansion means uh, incorporating or assimilating strange or unfamiliar things into your relational order. Uh, to to succeed, then you will have to unlearn yourself. You have to know what's going on in the other parts of the world in order to convince them that they are actually part of your world.
Mm.
And by doing that, you are also allowing the other part doing something to you. So you could coexist by incorporating each other in your own relational world. So you coexist not in the same world. You still stay in your own world, but then you are able to make sense of the other. You find a place in your relational order for the other, and allow the other to do the same to you in their relational order. So you don't challenge how the other side, assimilate you into their world.
Mm.
So you can coexist there for them, and they can coexist for you in your relational world. So that's what I call unlearning being a very important methodology to achieve coexistence. So coexistence doesn't mean that we come into the same world. It only means that we accept each other, but we each have our own way to accept each other. We don't force the other side to use the same way to accept each other. Um, so there is something reciprocal going on. The reciprocal process or practice is about allowing the other to accept you in their own ways, and to exchange for their courtesy of allowing you to accept them in your world and in your way. And I think that's what I've been doing in recent years in my field work, just trying to collect how people making sense of each other. There are, like I said, there are ways people can coexist without even dialogue. They can go by rules, right? In the market, you can go to the market, buy things, right? Um, Indonesian can go to the Chinese market to buy things, even though there are peddlers selling pork in the same market. But then you still go and buy whatever you need. So it's interesting. You see a mosque where in its neighborhood there are peddlers selling pork. There's just they go by market rules. But if you politicize that, then of course, then you will start trying to disband those people, or just simply get them, just expel them away. So I think a coexistence and learning, they come together. And I don't practice that consciously in class. But I think my teaching would convey this message. Because learning and coexistence is important message in my teaching, although I don't practice it. I don't force people to, in class to resolve whatever conflict they have in their lives. I don't do that. So I have no real practice. Maybe I should start doing something like forcing people taking different political positions, stance to practice. But I don't. I mean, that's it's not a deliberative democracy. So I don't. Yeah.
No. Well, thank you so much for your reflections. And I mean, speaking to that concept of relationality and coexistence, that was really interesting. So thank you so much to you. I do really appreciate all your reflections. You've given me so much to think about. So thank you so much.
I thank you also very much for having me say this. I don't have a time or a chance to say this kind of things before.
Well, thank you.